Hey everybody, it's Professor Keegan, and I'm here with our, wow, second to last weekly lecture for gender and popular culture. Um, this week we are progressing through a sort of three-stage unit on body genres. Um, the first stage in this unit, we looked at Get Out and the horror movie and Get Out's exploration of racial terror using fear. And this week we are looking at Moonlight and Melodrama, and I'll be talking a bit about how melodrama differs from the other dominant aesthetic mode of popular culture, which is realism today. So I'm hoping this will provide some background for you that you can then draw on to produce your own analysis of Moonlight over in the discussion groups. This week I have not given you a directed prompt to answer. I'm more curious at this point in the semester about your own ability to use some of this interpretive skills we've been building in this class to talk about what you found in this film. Um, Remember, we're pushing past description toward analysis and interpretation. So rather than describing what happens in the film, I'd like you to make an argument about how you think the film is using things like color, lighting, character, plot, music, symbolism, right? To build a set of meanings about gender, sexuality, and race. Okay? So today, we're going to be discussing popular body genres, realism, and melodrama, with the attention mostly on melodrama because, as I'll explain, the most of the forms of pop culture we're studying in this class are melodramatic in nature, versus realism, which is more associated with more elite culture, and is not as associated with things, with the sorts of groups that we're studying, like people of color, queer people, and women. Okay, so beginning with this great still from Moonlight, which I think is one of the most important shots in the film. You could write an entire prompt for the discussion board just on this image from the film, what it signifies, what's happening here, why we linger on Sharon's hand grabbing a fist of sand, right? And what that represents in terms of desire and loss and the single moment in time that is sort of the most meaningful moment in this film until the end, basically. So I like to start with it. Let's talk for a bit about aesthetic modes, gender and aesthetic modes. So we've been talking in this unit about popular genre. And one important thing to note about genre is that there are two basic aesthetic modes that tend to organize genre. There's a set of genres we more associate with men, and there's a set of genres we more associate with women. So when we think of men's culture, we often think of things like Westerns, sports, war films, historical drama. There are jokes about like dads watching the History Channel, right? Or like watching Platoon for the 100th time on television. These tend to be realist genres, and they tend to also take place in what we call the public sphere, meaning the area of culture that we associate with the economy, with public life, with government and law, outside the domestic space, right? And traditionally, those spaces were the purview of men in Western culture, right? That's where men were running the show. So those genres are more associated with men and with public life. They take place in public life. But there are a competing group of genres that we associate with women. And you probably are more easily able to name these because they are considered less serious and therefore more marked as devalued in our culture. And these tend to be things like romance, the soap opera, the romantic comedy, what we might call the chick flick, right? And these tend to be situated in the private sphere, meaning they take place in domestic space, in the home, And they tend to use melodrama as their primary aesthetic mode. Okay, so we have contrasts in setting, in tone, in the focus on different kinds of issues that tend to take place, and in terms of the types of genre addresses, meaning these genres imagine different audiences for themselves based largely on gender, but also class. Okay, so let's dig in a little bit further to this contradiction. So both realism and melodrama are what we would call dominant aesthetic modes. They're the major ways in which culture organizes meaning, broadly speaking. And they're also major ways in which popular culture genders our cultural environment, right? Like there are genres for men and there are genres for women. And that is an overarching kind of binary that is active in our cultural environment all the time. So when we're talking about realism and melodrama, what we're talking about are aesthetic modes that are widely recognized styles of producing beauty or meaning. They're larger than the genre. They are overarching dominant modes of organizing meaning that genres then package into specific formulas. So traditionally, realism has been associated with men, as well as with more elite and bourgeois culture. So serious culture, the kind of culture that you get taught in college, not in a class like this, where all we're doing is like pop culture, right? But the other culture, the serious culture, or what we would call the canon, right, of important literature and film, tends to be more realist. Whereas melodrama, which is associated with women, is also more prevalent in popular and working class culture. So, of course, most of the texts we're looking at in this class are working in a melodramatic mode because we're looking at popular media, right? We're looking at culture that's widely available and is not considered necessarily elite or award-winning or anything like that. Although Moonlight did win a lot of awards, right? But what I'd like you to think about is how these aspects of realism and melodrama are present in a lot of texts, even if they're not as easily classifiable. Like Moonlight is a drama, but it's got significant melodramatic aspects that make it speak effectively to the experience of Black queer masculinity, which I'll be talking about later in this lecture. So most of the body genres we're looking at in this class are melodramatic. Horror is a form of melodrama directed at teens. And so Get Out from last week, very much a melodrama. And as we move through some of the qualities of melodrama, you could think about why and what aspects of this aesthetic mode show up in that film. So let's unpack this a little bit. What are the differences? So realism does what it sounds like it does, right? It seeks to represent the world as it appears, to reproduce the dominant construction of reality precisely in the current moment. So realism tends to naturalize social hierarchies. It tends to just represent things as if they just are, rather than investigating how they came to be that way, what ideological forces have produced them to be that way, right? So it makes a lot of sense that realism would be a more patriarchal mode because it tends to naturalize men's dominance over women, white people's dominance over people of color, etc. It represents the individual first. And so because of that, it's driven more by character than by event. The character is the thing in the center, making everything happen. And so the character comes first and the world comes secondarily as the individual acts on the world. So it's very centered on the hero usually, right? So you can think about the action movie or the Western, right, as forms where there's a hero who's making decisions and doing things, and the world is reacting, right? And also the world is represented without much explanation. It's just there because that's how it seems. That's how it appears to sort of the dominant sensibility. By contrast, melodrama represents the world as it feels. Okay. So rather than how it appearing, we're thinking about how it feels to be in the world. So instead of showing the character acting on the world and asserting his usually will on the world, what we see is an emotional experience of living inside the world, especially the world's contradictions, which realism tends to iron out. There are a lot of ways in which we're expected to live that don't make any sense at all, right? Like you might be noticing that democracy and capitalism don't really work together. Like one is about everyone being equal, and the other one's about winners and losers. And there have to be winners and losers in a capitalist system. How do you get that to work with like a democratic form of government in which everyone's supposed to be provisionally equal? Like these are major problems that realism doesn't address. Melodrama tends to be a mode that helps us explore those contradictions by representing social forces as more powerful than the individual. So melodrama tends to be driven by plot rather than character. The characters are often responding to forces much more powerful than they are, and reacting to the repressive conditions that they're faced with. So you could think about Get Out as one example of this, right? Like the lead character in that film is in a situation not of his own making, and he has limited agency to escape it. I mean, the film is called Get Out, right? But the irony of that is that for Black people, there is no escape from the conditions of white supremacy. Like everybody's trapped in the scenario, right? So we didn't talk a lot about the titles of Get Out or Gone Home, even as a Gone Home's title as well is kind of a paradox. It's a home that's gone. You can't go home to a home that's gone, right? What does that mean? But yeah, Get Out is a great example of a melodramatic text that places characters in scenario. Sorry, I just dropped my phone. Places characters in scenarios not of their own making that they are victims of, and they have to grapple with an irrational situation that they did not produce in order to survive, right? So we feel what they feel. We feel that confusion, that fear, right? That sorrow, rather than a realist text showing the character like confronting and surmounting obstacles through will, right? Like an action movie. Okay. So we could say, why are both modes popular? I think they kind of work hand in hand, because realism presents this fantasy of control over the world, and melodrama presents us with the reality of that we don't have control over the world. And so melodrama is important because it admits and confronts in emotional terms the crises that realism tends to cover up and hide, right? There's a power fantasy often going on in realism that really centers like dominant subjectivities, like white men. And then when you go over to melodrama, you start to see that like, no, the culture isn't a meritocracy, and no, the systems we have aren't fair, and no, the suffering people encounter in their lives isn't necessarily their own fault, right? So I like to think of these two modes as the peanut butter and jelly, or peanut butter and chocolate, or peanut butter and banana, depending on your your personality, right? Two things that make each other better because one addresses the shortcomings of the other in some ways. And they really work together to sort of aesthetically balance each other. So I've included two clips on Blackboard along with this video that I'd like you to take a look at just to notice some differences between realism and melodrama. I'd first, considering what I just said about the properties of these modes, I'd like you to watch at least 5 minutes of this scene from Saving Private Ryan, which is a historical war film, right? Where the director is reproducing the conditions of the storming of Normandy in World War II. Notice there how realistic it is, right? There's no music. There are no real special effects. Everything is reproduced to kind of put you in the situation of these men acting on reality. There's no ideological framework presented at all. It's just men doing a thing. There's no social contextualization of what's going on at all, right? And then contrast that with something like Crash, this clip from Crash, which you can watch the whole thing. We've gone from a film with Saving Private Ryan that's about how the world appears, it's all about looking real, to a film that's all about how things feel. And believability of the scenario comes after that, right? Both clips represent violence, but they're explored in very different ways. And Crash is infamous for being a particularly intense example of generic melodrama. So take a look at the first 5 minutes of Saving Private Ryan clip, and then watch Crash, and be thinking about differences here, okay? So I'll give you a couple of seconds to do that, and then I'll continue the lecture. Okay, so hopefully you're noticing some differences between these modes. So melodrama as a popular form, right? Because it represents the individual not affecting the world, but being acted on by usually irrational forces in society, melodrama is often used to explore the experiences of oppressed groups. So it's a genre that's very much associated with women, but also LGBTQ folks and the working class, and to some extent, people of color. If you think about something like the telenovela, right? Ludicrous scenarios, high emotion. That's a Latinx genre form that's highly melodramatic, right? We could say many of the conventions of gay culture also use melodrama. So melodrama is important to the experiences of oppressed people because it allows us to socially contextualize the things that don't make sense in people's lives. Oppressed people are confronted with a lot of contradictory messages, right? We're all equal, but also you're not equal, or anyone can make it in America if they work hard enough, but also not you, because you're not white, or you go around having these experiences of oppression, but then everyone insists they're not happening, right? So there are a lot of contradictory experiences that oppressed groups go through that shatter that realist assumption of everything is just exactly how it appears and there's nothing else going on. And so a lot of oppressed groups are drawn to melodrama to communicate the experience of being acted on by these like completely irrational, confusing scenarios that we find ourselves in. And remember last lecture, I talked about temporality and fantasy, and how the fantasy of temporality and horror is always the too soon feeling of like the jump scare, the repressed thing coming back before we were ready to confront it. I talked about some other temporality structures of other genres. Well, the temporality structure of the melodrama is the if only, meaning there was a moment where things could have been different, but for some tragic reason, usually that moment was lost or cannot be returned to. Okay, so if we're going in a completely different temporal direction with melodrama than horror, where horror is about too fast and melodrama is about too late. Okay, missed opportunity. So the dominant affect or feeling in melodrama, rather than fear, is longing. Now, Williams says that it's about tears. Yes. So horror produces like sweat from fright, and melodrama produces tears. But the tears don't come from sorrow as much as loss, which is a similar but related but slightly different feeling, right? A feeling of longing that comes from wanting the world to be different than it is, which again, you can see how that would speak very much to the experiences of oppressed groups, right? If only I hadn't been born in X identity category, or if only history had turned out differently, or if only this tragic thing hadn't taken place, or if only I had been in a different place or time, right? Then my life would be different, but it's not, right? So this tension between what is and what could be really informs melodrama. I think one of the best examples of this structure is actually Dorothy singing Somewhere Over the Rainbow in The Wizard of Oz. It's like a classic melodramatic moment in a movie where she's expressing, I know something better that can exist, but it doesn't. And here I am in the black and white non-Oz, right? How does melodrama do this? Some of the features of this are that it uses music. Melodrama means a drama with music, right? So it uses music to illustrate the emotionality of the interior life of the characters in ways that are non-realistic. Like you might notice, music is just playing in the film, but it's non-diegetic. It's not coming out of a speaker that's in the scene. It's not meant to be anywhere but in the head of the character, right? Um, heightened emotion is used, especially heightened emotion produced through unlikely scenarios. Putting the character into a sort of irrational scenario to produce really intense emotions is one of the features here, as well as setting up impossible contradictions that produce that if only feeling that speaks to the actual sort of unacknowledged experiences of oppressed groups who are trapped in a world that says they don't exist or aren't equal, or because of XY thing about you, this is just the truth for you, even though someone else controls the mechanisms by which power is distributed, right? How do you make sense of a world like that? The world is pretty absurd. Melodrama helps us do that. The fundamental goal of melodrama is to produce pathos, which if you studied Greek rhetoric, you might know this term. It's one of the three modes of persuasion in Greek rhetoric. And for the purposes of our course, we'll just define it as a feeling of strong sympathy or pity over the suffering of somebody, right? This feeling of, oh, that poor person. And this sort of breaking down of the self and the extension of pity to this poor subjectivity trapped in this irrational world that treats them badly, right? That's like the main emotion that melodrama is usually shooting for, hence tears. So I'm not saying that melodrama is generically a melodrama. What I'm saying is that it's using melodrama as a motif to get at certain things that realism wouldn't help it do, right? So particularly because of how gender, race, and sexuality are constructed, those constructions set up Black masculine queerness as impossible. In order to be a Black man, you cannot be queer. We see this from the very beginning of the film, where Little is pursued and rejected and treated badly by his peers because they are all forming their masculinities. And as a Black man, because of how Black men have been emasculated under white supremacy, it's incredibly important to not be soft, right? To articulate a heterosexual and hypermasculine identity. So Black masculinity is constructed against queerness in ways that make it impossible to be both at once. And that's one of the conundrums here in the movie. So the film uses some of these conventions of melodrama um, to situate us within these contradictions, to say, this doesn't make sense, and yet here we are, right? So I know you're working on your prompts, or you're working on a response to my open prompt, right? In your discussions, and I'm asking you to comment on at least two now, make two comments to people's ideas. But I wanted to give you some things in the film that I think will push you into further into analysis beyond just saying this film is about homophobia. It is, but that's kind of obvious. So how is it effectuating its critiques? What is it saying about the impossible scenario that Little slash Chiron slash Black finds himself in? Um, and then how is it making us sympathize with him? What is it doing to us? What is it saying about the position of Black men in America? So I want to ask you to think about some of the formal components of the film, like why the ocean breeze as a motif, why the ocean as a motif, what happens in the film when the ocean shows up, what does it represent, what does it symbolize in the film, why is it there, um, why does the main character have three names? And why does his appearance shift so dramatically across the film, right? What is with this fragmented identity that's being presented to us, this shape-shifting that he's doing? And what does that add to the film? What does it communicate about Black queer masculinity and the sort of impossibility of being just himself, right? Um, there are instances where music plays a really strong role in this film, in different scenes. I'd like you to think about that. Why music in certain situations, and sometimes music will even drown out dialogue and become the main thing we're listening to. When does that happen and why? And what does it do for the viewer? From the very beginning of this film, we also are pushed outside realism by the very intense use of contrasting color. Colors are brighter in this film than they should be. Why? And especially the color theory of the film is very much about oppositional color. How does that set us up in certain ways with a certain aesthetic? And then remember that Moonlight is based on a play called In Moonlight, Black Boys Look Blue. So color is really important to the overall meaning in the film and in the original text. What is going on with color in this film and why? The camera shots are almost always subjective camera, meaning we are not dealing with a floating camera. We're dealing with a camera that's very much handheld and putting us like right in the scene. What does that do? How is that about individual over, putting the world over the individual instead of presenting the individual as in control of the world? Instead, we are kind of buffeted by everything. Think about the ocean scene where we're literally like floating in the water with the camera. Like, what does that produce for the viewer? And of course, there's the title, Moonlight. Where in the film do we see moonlight? Why is this the title of the film? And why does the title focus on a single moment in time or color of light? Okay. Thinking about blackness as a color. Okay. So those are just some thoughts about what melodrama adds to the expression of, we could say, minority cinemas. Really looking forward to see what you do with this film, because it's not as easy to analyze as something like Get Out, which is much more clearly a social melodrama. It's Jordan Peele called it a social issues thriller. Like, it's very legible. This film is more subtle. So I'm curious to see what you'll come up with. Excited to read your thoughts. Don't forget your research bibliographies are also due this weekend. I've been fielding questions from people about those. So if you have questions, make sure you get them to me ASAP so I can respond. And yeah, enjoy the film, and don't forget to comment on 2 posts this week. Okay? All right. I'll leave it there.